started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Angela Vasquez. I am the Policy Director at the Children's Partnership. I cover a portfolio that includes children's mental health, child welfare, and juvenile justice issues. For those of you who are new to our network, the Children's Partnership is a statewide California-based children's health equity organization. And this webinar is part 2 of a series. Many of you may have joined us for part 1, which really talked about the issues that very young children face, particularly as it relates to adverse childhood experiences and the important role that you as adults in young children's lives, whether it's as a parent, a child care provider, a home visitor, a clinician, or a program administrator, really play in supporting young children's social emotional development and building up those protective factors that may contribute to ongoing toxic stress. And so if you haven't had a chance to watch our part 1, I highly recommend that you do so after this webinar. It provides a wealth of information and resources that can help put into context some of what you're going to hear about today. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. The webinar is being recorded, so slides will be shared after the webinar. And also, please make sure to answer the survey that will open at the end of this webinar. We very much would like to know what you have learned. If I could get the next slide. Yep, next slide. Perfect. Great. All right. So before we launch into this, we'd love to find out who is in the virtual room with us tonight. So we have a couple of polls that we'd like for you to respond to. So the first one is asking, are you a home visitor, a child care provider, a mental health clinician, a regional center service provider, or other? And where applicable, if you could also let us know about how many young children do you serve directly. And note that if you do not serve children directly, there's an NA option for you to respond to as well. So go ahead and give folks a second to answer. All right, let me see. Close the poll. Nancy, do you mind showing the results of the poll? Can you do that? Just so folks can also see who has responded. Great, so quite a bit of you do serve young children, and it's nice to see so many home visitors here. Great, thanks, Nancy. Okay, so with that, I'm very excited to introduce to you Dr. Vilma Reyes. Dr. Reyes is an assistant clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco in the Child Trauma Research Program. Since 2009, she has been providing child-parent psychotherapy services, training, clinical supervision, consultation, and coordinating community-based mental health outreach services and evaluation. She is a national trainer in CPP and has co-authored articles and chapters on CPP theory and application. So thank you, Dr. Reyes, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Happy to be here. So wounding and healing, of course, has been part of the human experience since we've been a species. And I know you are well versed in trauma because this is a part two. So you've already covered all the ways that trauma impacts people, their ability to connect, their ability to learn, all areas of development, and what happens in the body, including the direct connection with physical health, when this brilliant system that it's designed to be used in short term to help us survive the present moment, the threat at hand, is overused and compromises many other systems in who we are. So for today, I will skip that part, and I want us to lean in a little bit deeper and focus more on what sometimes doesn't get assessed or asked for, the ACEs, if you will, that are not often asked about, which is not just interpersonal events and particular events that happen to people, but more the larger context, the historical, the interpersonal, the systemic or social cultural trauma that impacts young children and families and communities and systems really overall. And I want us to think about how we can interrupt systemic harm and how we can create systems of healing. In my 15 or so years of doing clinical work and working with predominantly immigrant families, probably the majority of the stress, the harm, the wounding, the symptoms that they present with have either been caused or exacerbated by broken systems, by racist systems. So I want us to look a little bit broader, and people don't exist in vacuums. We know that children don't exist in vacuums. They exist in the larger context of their relationships that are important to them, their families, but it doesn't end there. So I want us to look a little bit broader about what holds and sustains a family and what's the larger context. And so when we look at trauma that way, it's much more than just the impact of interpersonal events on people. It's more than that. It's historical, it is structural, it's political, it's intergenerational, it's interpersonal as well, and it's embodied, it's visceral. And if we really look at trauma in all those layers, then we need to look at healing occurring on all those levels as well. Our healing has to happen in all those ways, in structurally and intergenerational. We have to break these patterns. And I'm sure part one, you covered these types of traumas, right? Violence, assault, abuse, loss. And that's how most people think of and assess for trauma. That lives within the larger system of racism, oppression, xenophobia, homophobia, and beyond. And that sends such a clear message to young children of color, and it impacts their relationships and their sense of safety, their sense of being fundamentally safe or unsafe in the world. And looking at their parent and their ability to feel secure, like their parent is a big, strong superhero that can keep them safe in this unpredictable and scary world. We all need that. We all need that, especially in early childhood. That is how we internalize a sense of security, a sense of worthiness and sense of self. And that is what serves as the template for relationships in the future. When the people who care for you, your parents, your caregivers, the ones you love, look like those who you see in the news being shot for no reason in the hands of the police, when you see families that look like your parents and yourself who are being stripped from the hands of their parents at the border and being put in institutions or cages, all of these things send a message to young children. Children of color don't have the luxury to have this myth that their parents can't keep them safe in this big, scary world. That myth is supposed to be preserved until the person developmentally around adolescence, you realize, oh man, my parents actually don't know everything. That typical trajectory is interrupted when children of color see their parents not be valued, not be respected. And it also impacts their parents' ability to feel like they can be a protective. they can take up that protective shield and protect their children from harm, from danger. So I want us to look at all these ways, small and big ways, in which economic injustice, even environmental injustice, sets up a young child within the context of the family. Of course, people are so much more than trauma, and I will be talking a lot about strength as well. But before we get there, we have to first really lean on and be able to acknowledge the impact of all of these layers on the developing brain, on the child, on the relationship. And so this is where I want us to focus on today. When you have all of these together, it really creates this sense of synergistic trauma, or like toxic brew, in which there might be interpersonal events, but they exist in a larger culture of inadequate housing, overcrowdedness, poverty, so on and so on, police brutality, and you name it. The horrific fear that immigrant families are on at all times, of being separated, of being deported, of not being able to even leave their home or go to the grocery store at times. In the past 4 years, I've had families say they're afraid to go to the grocery store because they heard there were raids. So think about all of that. How do you classify that? How do you assess for that? How do you treat for that? When the system is what's broken, not the person. And so that is a call for action to all of us to really assess and look for that layer and engage system change. Intergenerational trauma. Of course, there's the transmission of trauma, as there is also the transmission of strength and grit and survival and lucha. How does one generation teach the next generation about what you need to do to survive, and what happens across generations? What are adaptations that one has had to do, or things they have had to lose from their culture that were protective factors to adapt to colonization, 500 plus years of slavery? What does that do to a people? The Native American community traditionally have this belief that children are the sacred spirits returning to earth, and that their role as parents is to nurture and protect them. Corporal punishment wasn't even part of that culture, and their children were stripped from their arms and put in very abusive boarding schools, and separated from their parents and ripped from their language and their customs and their land. So we can't look at we can't look at a person without context, without looking at how this history has impacted them over time, introducing things like substance use and abuse and things that weren't even part of that culture before we got here. So what has been the legacy, not only of wounding, but also of survival, that have been passed down, that maybe we can tap into? In the immigrant community, we have research that shows that recent immigrants have higher health outcomes, and that over time gets lost. We could account that to acculturative stress. We could account to adapting to or acculturating to poor eating habits, poverty, oppression here. But either way, there was something really protective that they brought in terms of health outcomes that gets lost over time. They call this the immigrant paradox, because it is a paradox. People come here 1,500 miles, blisters on their feet, fighting to survive for their children, for them to have a better life. That is why they do it. And data shows that over time, a lot of those protective factors in terms of health get lost. So what do we need to preserve? What do we need to tap into in terms of strengths that people bring in? And really working with them and honoring what they bring to the table, what they bring in terms of strengths. We also have on a molecular level, epigenetics, and we know that trauma leaves, a mark on people's genes that are expressed in the next generation. So looking at context and history, looking at science, looking at, all that we know about neuroscience, there is something that gets passed on, both the wounding and the healing. And I think that that's part of the story that we need to hold in mind. because it can be easy to look at the child, look at the family, look at their strengths, and also look at their wounding and manifestations of problems, without looking at the broader context that shaped it and that maintains it. I've made a commitment to myself, and I encourage all of you to make a commitment to yourself and within your teams, that whenever you talk about families in an effort to help them, whenever you discuss cases, in everything that you do and how you show up in the work and with each other, that you make a commitment that we don't talk about person's manifestation of pain and suffering, which is usually what symptoms or problems, without also talking about the context that shaped it, without talking about the strengths that they developed to overcome it. That young child that is at risk of being expelled from preschool, throwing a chair at their teacher, is more than just that behavior, and needs to be seen within that context, needs to be seen for the anger that's underneath this exhibit of behavior that they're trying to show. Children need that, families need that, and we need that. We need to have a more holistic view of trauma and wounding and healing, I think. Again, I won't go into the biology of fight, flight, or freeze. I know you've heard this before. But I want us to look at, especially with these types of trauma, the chronic, pervasive impact of that insidious type of trauma that over time overwhelms the system, that gives people these three things that are so important, so necessary, that all humans need: sense of control, connection, and meaning. And time I've read everything I could get my hands on trauma, and all the theories, all the research I could find. But if I were to sum it all up for you, these are the three things that you will see as manifestations of trauma and also of healing. So that the little boy throwing the chair is maybe a not very adaptive way, but it is a way that this child is trying to regain a sense of control. Sense of control, by definition, was robbed from him because of trauma. Trauma, by definition, takes that from you. And so if we look at efforts that this little boy was trying to have in being connected, in re-engaging a sense of connection. Again, connection is impacted by trauma because it disrupts our sense of trust and being able to connect to another. And so healing has to happen in connection. And we know this, we have so much research that shows that is how the brain heals. The brain heals through relationships. And meaning, we need to help people and partner with parents to help them speak the unspeakable with their children and help them make meaning of the things that have happened in their life. We know, and I get it as a parent, it's so painful to know that your child might have been hurt in some way. And especially if there was something you did or didn't do or couldn't do to stop it. But children need their parents to help them understand and make meaning of the things that have happened. All too often, especially young children, parents, it's much easier to say, they didn't understand, they don't remember, they won't know. And parents don't talk about hard things with their young children. And that leaves them alone to help them figure out their story without the help of the parent in it. And so in whatever role you're in, and I'm very curious about the majority of you that said other, but in whatever role you're in and how you're engaging with families, especially, this talks and my work has been specifically with immigrant families, we need to really hold the context of what would cause ruptures in relationships and how can we increase a sense of connection, sense of control, and meaning. You could really look at these three words and assess program development. Is it really giving the community a sense of control? Are they having really voice and choice in whatever you're planning? And I think they're guiding words to help us truly be trauma informed. I think trauma informed and trauma informed systems care, all these things have become words that we hear all the time now. And I think that's great that there's more awareness of trauma, but I think we have to look a little bit deeper. We can't be trauma informed and not look at social justice. We can't be trauma informed and not give the community voice and choice. They need that sense of control that was robbed from them as a result of trauma. They need some sense of ownership into their treatment, their care, the community involvement, whatever types of roles or things that you're doing with families. Especially for young children, some of the things we see with overactivation of of the fear response is either this like constant alertness or this kind of frozen watchfulness. A lot of times these kids fall through the cracks because they're not disrupting systems. They're not the kids throwing chairs. The kid throwing a chair is very clear. They're making it very clear that they need help. And they're very good at disrupting the systems around them so that adults, step into action and help. I want us to look out for the kids who aren't playing. If there's a kid that's not playing, that is the most natural, innate beauty of childhood. The child who maybe is having a, isolated or not engaging, not connecting with other kids, not connecting with adults, seeming afraid or alert at all times, even when it doesn't seem necessary. Those kids tend to like justify, especially if grown-ups haven't given them an explanation of the things that have happened in their life, they tend to assume it was because it was their fault or they were bad. All children in a way have that. So I want us to pay attention to those kids. And then lastly, and again, I could go into any of these for the whole morning, but trying to stay brief, the parent-child relationship is directly impacted by trauma because this developmental expectation of protection is disrupted most of the time due to systems that aren't working. I have been seeing so many families since the separations at the border that are now showing up for treatment after months of separation. And it is truly heartbreaking to hear the children, this little girl saying to her mother, they experienced horrific things in their home country, Guatemala. And the journey here was horrific. But the mom will tell you there was nothing worse than her daughter being taken from her, because at least through the other adversities, they were together. And this little girl who had not exhibited violence or aggression before, violence was the wrong word, aggression before, even despite all the adversities they went through together, when she was reunified with her mother, this little girl kept hitting her, throwing things at her, and mom just was heartbroken, coming to treatment saying, my little girl is calling me names, is yelling at me, she won't open up to me. I know she was hurt. I don't know what happened to her in those months. This little girl telling her mother in the treatment session, you lied to me. You told me we would be okay. So what happens when it's really the system that is causing these ruptures of trust? And now we're going to have generations of work of healing to do as a result of those separations. And unfortunately, separation has been part of the immigrant story even before forced separations by our government. Often part of the journey involves some type of separation, with families fleeing before other members do. And so we really have to look at attachment and the lens of attachment when we look at the impact of relationships, especially with trauma and immigration, and thinking, what are opportunities of healing within this relationship? What has been ruptured for this child? The immigrant community is, of course, so large and diverse, and many of them are the driving force of ingenuity and innovation in this country, as it's always been. What we've seen more of, at least in my work, and what we're seeing more in the news is more asylum seekers escaping Central America, which referred to as the Northern Triangle. This region was terribly destabilized, and there's a long history here, including US involvement of what we financially supported in Central America that caused so much violence and despair and hunger and poverty. Some of this is larger problems, like even the loss of crops due to global warming and just devastating hunger. So we need to look again at that context when we are thinking of context that brings about fleeing violence in community. Nobody leaves their home if they can help it. Many parents have said it is an impossible decision of risking my children's life by leaving or risking their life by staying. And in all those 1,500 miles with hunger and cold and blisters, they are fighting to come to a place that they know they will be unwelcome, that they will be hated, that they will be underpaid, but that at least their children might live, that they might at least might have a chance. This level of strength and resilience that pushes people to take this journey is remarkable. And we need to really acknowledge that, because when we're working with the immigrant community, we're working with people that have hope, that have courage, that will do whatever it takes for their children. And that needs to be recognized, and that needs to be met with and tapped. We need to tap into those resources, help them see it in themselves, help their children see it, so that we can start healing these parent-child protective shields that have been harmed. We can start restoring that, because all the pain in immigration and the trauma that often is what prompts people to come here is not all of the story. It is, there's a story there of hope, and that story needs to also get passed on to children. And that is the protective narrative of optimism and bravery that we need to recognize. And how do we do that? Well, we look at strengths. We look at what we know from the research is the best shot we got. These are mediating factors in complex trauma and overexposure to trauma. Most of these are quite intuitive, in that the closer you are to the person that hurt you, the worse the outcomes, right? If there are more losses associated with the trauma or the abuse, the worse the outcomes. Same, you just go down the line. But what might be sometimes surprising or maybe comforting for those of you who are working so much in early childhood and supporting parents is to know that the best predictor of outcome for children following a traumatic event is the caregiver's ability to cope with the traumatic event. I spoke about this already. And so if we want to help young children, we have to help their parents. We have to help their grown-ups, their caregivers, and really partner with them to promote wellness in children. How can we support and preserve these protective factors that we know they come with, and that often gets lost across the generations? This beautiful picture is just so heartwarming of both the struggle, but also the beauty, the being together, that is often part of the immigrant story. So what can we do? What can you do as part of systems? We need to, again, promote community voice and choice, make space, continue to be advocates to change systems that aren't working, that are oppressing people, that really that's the crime. Poverty is a crime. There's enough resources in the world for everybody, but the unequal access to that, it causes so much harm. So look at the system you're in, both the smaller system of where you work, but also the larger system of what is our role in the larger system that we all live in, and how can we directly target what might be risk factors for immigrant families. So how can we increase access? How can we have staff that represent the community we're serving? And not just Spanish speaking, but Quiche and Mam and all the dialects that people are coming in having, that there have no representation or cultural representation among staff. We need to do better. If we want children to do better, we need their parents to do better. And if we want parents to do better, we need to do better. We need to be the systems that support parents so that parents can support their children. So let's look at systems. So systems, they have a life of their own. So just like trauma impacts the person, the family, the community, trauma has an impact on the system overall. It has a life of its own. And if you do nothing to a system, if you just let it be and you're trauma exposed, I guarantee you will become trauma reactive, because that's the most natural way. That is what trauma does. Trauma fragments. So if no intention is built otherwise, if there's no reflection built in, a trauma will become trauma reactive. It will be fragmented. There will be no sense of safety among the people in the system. People will feel overwhelmed, driven by fear, reactive. They're triggered, they react. It's a rigid system, a numb system, has to protect itself so much that it doesn't feel anymore. That's a trauma-inducing system. And now look at all the systems that we're a part of. How many of them are trauma-inducing? Even as a country, how have we been triggered and reactive in the past? And that kind of just further creates more trauma. We have done a really good job, I think, in the past 20 years, 10 years, to bring more awareness to the ACEs study, to trauma-informed care. And most people, they have a better awareness of like, okay, we need to realize what trauma is, and understand trauma, all the components of a trauma-informed system, being culturally humble and responsive, looking at resilience, looking at social emotional learning, realizing the impact of trauma, including all the social cultural traumas I talked about today, recognizing the effects, responding by actually shifting practice and resisting re-traumatizing people. That is great. That is a trauma-informed system, and we need that. But I don't think that's all. I think we can push ourselves forward to create systems that in themselves reduce trauma in the system, trauma reducing systems that are safe, that are supportive, that are healing systems that really recognize people's strength, that are flexible, that are equitable, that are growth promoting, that are truly collaborative with the community, that center relationships, and that bring reflection in everything you do. Take a minute to reflect on your week routine in the systems you're in. How much time is built into reflection, to being reflective about our work? What comes up for us as providers if we're working with people that are unjustly exposed to complex trauma? How, if we don't react, if we don't reflect on all those feelings, we will react on them, and we will be a trauma reactive system. These systems aren't rigidly defined. You're not in a box. So if you're looking at these boxes and finding your system, you're going to see that you're maybe in many places, and it kind of depends, right? Because systems are fluid. So you might be at best a safe, supporting, healing system, but when triggered, you might become more of a trauma reactive system. And that's it. That's part of it. But then the important part is to pause and say, wait, what happened to us? Boy, we were really reactive there. We made a decision that actually wasn't in the best interest of the community. It didn't work. Let's go back to, our base and reflect on what happened. What did we learn? And can we integrate that into how we make more decisions in the future? So a striving to be this type of system is important. When working with the immigrant community, being connected and being informed, it is a big part, because things are always changing. Just even with this new administration, there's a lot of changes that have happened in terms of policy. The Stay in Mexico policy has changed recently, and so you all constantly are changing in terms of like what people qualify for, how they're impacted by policies. And so staying connected is a big piece, and informed, so we can really give families accurate information, accurate referrals, and not have them go through loops or be sent to places where they actually won't be helped. And lastly, I never talk about trauma without talking about vicarious trauma. I think again, this is kind of the natural reaction. It's a cultural, it's a psychological phenomena that happens to people. It's very different than like burnout, which is more gradual. This can be a really sudden phenomena in which we're mimicking PTSD symptoms by being exposed to hearing about the stories, the injustice, the trauma, the hurt, the wounding. That in and of itself can create in us almost exactly the same symptoms as somebody that experienced it directly. We need to be aware of that. We need to pay attention of our reactions when we're working with families, and be able to identify for ourselves and for our system. How do I know when I'm being impacted? How do I know when I need extra support? How do I reach out? How do I regulate my feelings in the moment and remain balanced, so that we can not be numb, so that we can stay feeling? Because that's what people need. People need us to stay connected. That is what heals. It's relationships, but we can't possibly keep connecting if we're overwhelmed by the impact of the affect that comes along with that connection and what comes along with knowing about trauma. So I encourage you all to engage in lifelong growth and reflection. This is beautiful work, and we can have a lifelong of perspective building. I am always inspired and growing by the families that I work with. If we let it, if we're open to it, if we really use reflection to continue growing. And that is the only way we can truly give quality care and be systems that are truly trauma reducing and healing for immigrant families, and really all families of color. Thank you. I hope I stayed in the time zone that we were aiming for. I want to make sure that you have time for questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Reyes. We have a few questions, and please, as folks are thinking of questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We also appreciate your comments as well. Any aha moments that you've had through this presentation. So we can start with a couple of questions I have here. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about kids who are exhibiting internalizing behaviors. So you flagged that in your presentation. What are some signs that can help providers who aren't clinicians know if something is sort of worth investigating, or whether a kid is just quiet or shy? How would I know the difference if I'm working with a kid?
Oh, thank you. That's a good question. Let me think about it for a second. Because I do want to distinguish that being more of an introvert or a quiet kid is not necessarily a risk factor, but there is a difference. True introverts, I mean, they still seek connection and need connection. They just get energy differently. They get more energy by they need some time alone to kind of rewire, but then they do still engage with others. We are wired to be social beings. So when you see a child completely isolated and not able to connect or engage with any of the children around them or the adults around them, to me, that's a big marker. If you have free choice time, recess, and all the kids are running out to play, and you see a child that seems preoccupied, worried, sad, and is not playing at all. It's not that they're playing alone and happily on their own, but they're just not engaging at all when playing. That's concerning. Those kids desperately need somebody to connect with them. And if that connection isn't there, I would say that that's a risk factor, and different than just maybe a quiet or slow to warm up kid, which is absolutely, fine and within the range of personality and how we all show up in spaces. So not to pathologize the quiet kids, but there is a difference. All kids in some way and in their own way, they all play, they all connect. That is their job, is learning the tasks of loving and being and connecting. And if they're not doing that's where it becomes more worrisome.
Got it. Thank you. One of the questions we actually had come up last time that I think I'd love your perspective on. When explaining ACEs and trauma to providers, folks who work with young kids, what are some misperceptions that they have? Are there any patterns, and even parents, sort of when you're explaining to parents what adverse childhood experiences are, what are some of those misperceptions? And then how did you get to an aha moment with someone who maybe had those misperceptions?
Misperceptions on what qualifies as a trauma, or the impact of it, or any of the above?
Any of the above. I think the question here is sort of referring to folks who are like, oh, they're too young to remember.
Yeah. That's what I get a lot of. So they agree. Most of the time, people agree. Yeah, this event, I wish this event hadn't happened. I can see how this event was not in the, they're more likely to recognize that this is an adverse experience. What I see more of then is, though, this didn't impact my kid. My kid was sleeping. They don't know. They don't understand. I'm happy to share a story. This is one of the first families I worked with a long time ago. And this kind of helped guide my trajectory into doing family work. And I kind of never went back to individual work with children, because I really saw the value of working with the system rather than just the person or the child. But this little girl was referred to me in a child care center because she was having a really strong reaction to separating from her mom. She would scream in the morning, and she would not be able to be soothed for like sometimes 20 minutes. She would cling on to her mom's leg, and her mom literally had to like peel her off and leave, and sometimes like run away. The childcare center was starting to make all these negative attributions about this mom. She doesn't care. She just wants to leave. She's leaving her. She doesn't care. Her kid is screaming. Meanwhile, and they were so frustrated with this little girl. They couldn't soothe her. It was very disruptive to the rest of the class. She was at risk of being expelled. They were like, we're not able to, so she was referred to treatment with me. I meet with the mom. She's very cautious, very protected, and says, I don't know why she's doing this. I just need to go to work. And she knew, and she felt very judged by the site. So she was very hesitant to tell me more. It took me a lot of time to build trust with her, for her to say, well, I don't think, she's barely 3. She was 2 and some, and very verbal kid, but little. And she said that I don't see how she would know this, but her dad was deported 2 weeks ago. After a lot of prompting, like, is there any way how do you understand this? Is there anything she might be trying to tell you? What's her fear? What's going on? And eventually she told me that she didn't want me to tell the site. And I said, well, what did you tell her? How did you explain this to her? And she said, what do you mean explain it to her? She's so little. And they took him, they deported him when she was at school. So she didn't see it. So she doesn't know. I said, but she must have some idea of where he went. And mom says, well, every time she asks for him, I just say he's at work. Because how do I explain this to a little kid? So I just say he's at work. He's at work. I said, okay, so for the past 2 weeks, you've been telling her that daddy went to work and she never saw him again. And what do you tell her in the morning when you leave to go to work? And mom said, I tell her I have to go to work. And is it possible that she think when people go to work, they go poof? My daddy went poof. And now you're telling me you're going to work? That is so frightening for a kid. She might think, who's going to take care of me if you go poof, right? She was, so she thought it was nuts. Like, what do you mean? She can't be thinking all of this. She's a little girl. But over time, we said, well, let's try it. Could you explain this to your kid in a way that's true, that preserves the trust with you, that you're telling her the truth, so she's not filling in the gaps on her own, and that also is developmentally appropriate. You don't need to tell her in all of the details, everything that's happened, but maybe she needs to have a story. She needs to make meaning of her dad's absence. And so we decided, and we did this together. So we invited the little girl in, me and mom talked to her, and mom said, you tell her. So I told her what we agreed on together, mom and I. And we decided, we showed her a map, and we said there's different lines that people made up that separate countries, and they each have different rules. And there's a rule here that you have to have a special paper if you come from Mexico, and they noticed your daddy didn't have that paper. So he went back to Mexico to get it. And he didn't want to go. And he misses you. And he really is trying so hard to come back to you. And when I said this to the little girl looked to her mom and asked her, no es mi culpa? It's not my fault? And the mom just softened. Her body's softened in a way that she never did with me, or that I had never seen. And she embraced her and said, of course not, honey. Of course not. And the little girl, because there had been an argument between them about discipline, and then she never saw him again, just thought, mom put it together that she thought, like, I did something bad and therefore daddy left. I know this doesn't make sense, but that's what young kids do. If they're not giving an explanation for their life, they will fill in the gaps, and this is how they will make sense of it. This is also a story of how important it is that it was the mom that repaired that. If I had said this to the little girl, this stranger, it wouldn't have been as powerful. Oh, no, that can't be a little girl's fault that parents go poof. Like, I'm sure that's not what happened. That's different than the mom saying it to her. See that? And thirdly, if I had just focused on her behavior, her cleanness, her tantrums, they call them, if I had just focused on the behavior without looking at the context, without learning the story, and I had done like maybe positive reformation, whatever behaviorists do to help the tantrum stop, I would have missed the boat. I would have missed what this kid was in her right place to communicate, of what she needed to communicate. And then lastly, with this story, it taught me about systems. This mom felt so judged, so afraid of being expelled by the system. Black boys get expelled at 3 times the rate as white boys from preschool. And for Latino, Latinx kids, it's twice the rate. This little girl was about to become a statistic. And mom was right. She was judged by the system. I talked to them. I heard them describe her. So she's not crazy. She's not making this up. So systems need to think a little bit more about that context to be able to hold. So this is a long-winded answer, but it actually It actually gives you an example of many concepts I talked about today, so I went with it. But that's what I see the most of is I acknowledge this was adverse, this was trauma, this was bad. Sometimes they have a reaction to the word trauma, but they will recognize, I acknowledge this was not a good thing that this happened. But my kids didn't really see it. They didn't. That's what I hear the most of. How I handle that is I don't bump up against it and say, oh, no, they were impacted. Obviously, because that's not how people work. We first have to understand where that's coming from and saying, I really wish that were true. Like that makes a lot of sense that you would want to think that because you want to protect your kid. And then once they really feel seen and heard from you, you can find an entry for softening that a little bit and seeing, well, I'm also seeing that maybe they do remember, or maybe they do are showing me in some way. Um,
Yeah,
that's the answer.
Thank you for
That's the
that.
very long answer
Yeah.
to your question.
That was it was a great answer because you hit on there are a, a small handful of questions that sort of asked about, what lessons from working with immigrant families are applicable to responding to the impacts of COVID on children of color more broadly. So you made the association with, behavior, how we interpret the behaviors of Black and brown boys in particular, and how that leads to, expulsions from care settings. Um, Another question we have here, somewhat related, is, we know, child development experts are anticipating lots of separation anxiety, sadness, confusion as, we sort of start to open things up again, parents start to go back to work, and kids go back into care settings, right? Many kids are have been for the last year or so at home with parents, and now, you know things are shifting again as they did a year ago. I'm wondering, if you, from a systems perspective, what are some ways that systems, childcare settings or programs, what are some ways that they can be more trauma responsive, right? This is going to be a stressful time for young kids.
Mhm.
How What can we learn about making our systems more responsive to what we know kids are going to be feeling in this moment?
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to my guiding words and see how they can fit. So control and choice. Um, so much of these decisions feel to a young child kind of arbitrary, and for very young children, all they remember is COVID. So the more we can build in control, meaning predictability, building choice in, the more children will target their sense of insecurity and fear, right? And for parents, their parents' fear of, because sometimes I think parents are also going to have a hard time with this new transition, some of them. So building in how, like, more transitional time and more ways that they can anticipate and have some choice about the day, about what this transition will look like. The next is connection, which is kind of tough to do with 3 to 6 feet. I don't know how people do that with very little kids. That seems like impossible to me from my experience as a preschool teacher, but I commend all of you for trying, and I'm curious to know what this new phase brings. But I think the more we can be patient and acknowledge that children will have a reaction, anticipate for them that this is a change, and see if we can build opportunities for them to feel the connection, like feeling connected with what might be new teachers to them, new peers to them. Like, I think we might be seeing a social emotional, at least socially, some kids might be a little bit behind or have had no practice or less practice with other peers. So as if we have a system can prepare and build up more support, more resources, more just predictability and control. And I think they also will need kind of a story and sense of meaning of, like, the story of COVID, which we have a lot of books and things to help us explain to kids, but what happened and how are things safer now, and what are they safe here, and where will their, depending how young they are, like, where will their parent be when they're here, like almost as you would to a new kid transitioning to preschool for the first time or to childcare for the first time, because a year in their mind is basically probably all they remember. I have a 3-year-old that doesn't remember pre-COVID. So It's a new world we're venturing, and I don't claim to have all the answers either because I haven't ventured into it. I'm doing it with you, but I do think that what we've learned from trauma is that it's the unpredictable nature that's overwhelming. So the more you can predict things, the better, more sense of agency and control people feel. And this is the same for young kids and parents. So the more they feel like they have some choice, I've seen this with all the teachers that I consult with as well. They want to feel like they have some choice about when and how they come back, which makes sense. So the more we can build that in to, like, yes, we're re-entering, but what are the ways we can consider your input and how to do that? I think you can't go wrong with that. Don't come back to me if it doesn't work. I'm not guaranteeing it. I'm trying it myself, but like I'm betting on it.
Okay, here's an interesting question. I'm curious if you have an answer. Um, Someone asked, how can childcare providers be sensitive to family choices relative to the vaccine? So we know, especially a lot of our providers are working with families and communities who may have legitimate, fears or unanswered questions about the vaccine. So do you have any tips or advice about how providers might even start that conversation with families?
Oh, that's tough. I've never been stumped in an answer. This might be the first time. I am considering, of course, choice is so important, and yet there is like a public policy perspective as an organization makes and has the right and to make certain requirements, I guess, of how to keep the public safe, but you can't really impose that on people either. So I don't know what the answer to that is. I think that's part of these new waters that call for new oars that we need to navigate together. I mean, similar to other vaccines, schools have always had requirements for children to be vaccinated, but also parents have been able to opt out or get a teacher or a doctor's note for either religious or personal reasons. And I guess in the same way that has been handled is how I would handle this. We might be able to find a middle ground in which if parents make that choice, they of course are in their right to make that choice. But what that means in terms of policy and re-entry, I guess that's collaboratively decided, including the systems, input. But we're talking about vaccinations for the adults, right? Not the children.
I think that's what the question is asking.
Like we're
So
asking for parents to be vaccinated before their children come back, or I guess.
yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure, but
Yeah,
um,
I could see providers. That would be even more tricky, right? I mean, my bias is that most providers want to be vaccinated, but if there's some that don't want the vaccine, that's a really complicated, layered question too of what that would mean. I don't know. I don't know.
thank you for letting me stump you.
Yeah, it's always first.
um, so there are a couple of questions generally asking about sort of resources or specific any sort of last recommendations you have about um, professional development for the early childhood workforce around becoming more trauma responsive, especially in light of COVID. So either here or we can certainly, you and I can collate some resources to send out to folks along with the recording and the slides. But any that come to mind right now that you maybe want to share with folks before we wrap?
I like your idea of coming up with a list together. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, nctsn.org, like they have a lot of resources there, and they have, I think you can find some webinars. There's been some really great webinars. I mean, despite how terrible COVID has been for so many people, there has been kind of what do they call that saying in English? The lining and the whatever.
Silver lining.
Silver lining is the access that we've had to information, and there's a lot of excellent webinars on that maybe I can come up with a list together, and I think some might be posted on that website.
Great, great. Thank you. Okay. Well, Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. We appreciate you giving us an hour of your evening. Thank you again, Dr. Reyes, for such great information and engaging conversation. Appreciate you letting me stump you with a question. And just for everyone here, we will be sharing the resources that we just referenced, as well as the recording and the information, the slides shared here. We'll be sending that out to folks who registered and also who attended. So with that, thank you so much, everybody. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you. Bye.
Yeah, bye.